When the abandoned laboratory was finally opened after 60 years, researchers found human skin samples that were not only preserved, but still growing, multiplying in their nutrient baths without any power source. The skin had developed strange, vein-like structures that pulsated when touched, as if they contained a primitive circulatory system that had evolved independently over decades of isolation. The discovery team from Berlin University stood frozen, watching the pale, translucent tissue slowly ripple under the beam of their flashlights, breaking scientific understanding of cellular longevity and tissue preservation. Dr. Heinrich Weiss, head of the Forensic Archaeology Department at Berlin University and the leader of the research team, immediately ordered the laboratory sealed. His hands trembled as he made the call to the German Federal Police. "This defies everything we know about cellular degradation," he whispered into the phone, his voice barely audible as his colleagues continued to stare at the living tissue samples. "These specimens should have decayed within days without proper refrigeration and nutrients, but they're not only preserved, they're evolving." The laboratory had been discovered during renovation work on an old building in the outskirts of Munich, a structure that had once been part of a scientific research complex established in 1938. Hidden behind a false wall and sealed with concrete, the secret room would have remained undiscovered if not for the structural assessment that had detected an unexplained void in the building's layout. The construction workers who first broke through the wall had immediately retreated upon seeing the eerie glow emanating from within, a pale blue-green phosphorescence that seemed to pulse with a rhythm reminiscent of a heartbeat. What made the discovery even more disturbing was the meticulous documentation found beside each sample. Leather-bound journals filled with elegant handwriting detailed experiments performed by one Dr. Wilhelm Schroeder, a scientist whose name had been virtually erased from historical records. The journals described his work with immortal tissue cultures derived from what he referred to only as special subjects. The most recent entry was dated April 20th, 1945, just 10 days before Hitler's suicide and the fall of Berlin. As Dr. Weiss carefully turned the brittle pages of Schroeder's journal, his face paled. "These are not normal human cells," he said to his assistant, Dr. Eva Mueller. According to these notes, Schroeder believed he had isolated what he called the biological essence of the soul, a cellular structure that could continue functioning independently of the body, potentially indefinitely. The journal described how Schroeder had observed the cells developing neural-like pathways after just months in isolation, forming connections that should have been impossible without a central nervous system. Eva leaned closer, her breath fogging in the cold air of the laboratory. "But that's impossible," she whispered. "Cells can't—" She stopped mid-sentence as one of the skin samples visibly contracted, forming a ridge-like structure that slowly moved across its surface before subsiding again. She staggered backward, knocking over a stack of dusty glass containers that shattered against the floor. The sound echoed through the silent laboratory like a gunshot. The most disturbing aspect of the discovery wasn't just the living tissue, it was what the tissue was doing. In several of the larger samples, the skin had formed distinct patterns, almost like primitive fingerprints, or, more unsettlingly, like writing. One researcher claimed she could make out what appeared to be German words formed by the ridge patterns in the largest sample. Words that, when translated, seemed to be pleas for help. The German government quickly classified the discovery, establishing a containment protocol that restricted access to only the highest-level researchers with special clearance. But before the laboratory was completely sealed, photographic evidence had already been leaked online. The images showed something the official reports had omitted. Some of the tissue samples had developed rudimentary eyes, clusters of photosensitive cells that tracked movement in the room. Deeper investigation into Schroeder's background revealed connections to a covert scientific division operating outside the oversight of conventional Nazi research programs. This division, known only as Abteilung 11 or Department 11, had been granted extraordinary autonomy and resources to pursue what internal documents called transcendent biological research. According to files recovered from Soviet archives decades later, Department 11 operated under the direct authority of Heinrich Himmler, who believed their work could provide the Third Reich with biological weapons of unprecedented power. Former Soviet scientist Mikhail Petrov, now 98 years old, was interviewed about the discovery. His hands shook uncontrollably as he recounted what he had seen when Soviet forces captured several of the Nazi biological research facilities in 1945. "We found laboratories with similar samples," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But our commanders ordered everything destroyed. One of my colleagues tried to preserve a sample for study. 3 days later, he was found dead in his quarters. The sample was missing, and there was a trail of something leading from his body to a vent in the wall. We never found it." What Petrov described next sent chills through the interview room. "The tissue we found had developed mobility," he said. "Small pieces had detached from the main cultures and were found in various parts of the facility. They appeared to be searching for something, and some of the larger samples had formed what looked like faces, human faces that would change expression when observed." The researchers who continued to study the Munich laboratory findings began experiencing strange symptoms. Dr. Klaus Weber, who spent the most time analyzing the tissue samples, reported hearing whispers when alone in the laboratory. Whispers in German that seemed to emanate from the direction of the samples. At first, he attributed this to exhaustion and the power of suggestion. But when audio recording equipment picked up the same whispers, voices asking for nourishment, for freedom, for death, the research team was rotated out and replaced with military personnel. The nutrient bath in which the samples were suspended defied chemical analysis. While it contained recognizable components like glucose, amino acids, and various minerals, there were compounds present that couldn't be identified with modern spectrometry. More alarmingly, the fluid level in the containers never decreased, despite open exposure to air for over 6 decades. It seemed to replenish itself through some unknown process, maintaining precisely the same volume regardless of environmental conditions. When samples of the tissue were removed for analysis, they exhibited signs of distress. The remaining tissue in the original containers would pulse more rapidly, and the extracted samples would deteriorate within hours, as if whatever was keeping them alive could only function within the original environment established by Schroeder. Even more disturbing, the original samples appeared to reach toward their extracted portions, extending thin tendrils of tissue in the direction of the removed pieces. Dr. Mueller made a breakthrough when she discovered Schroeder's secondary journal, hidden in a compartment beneath the laboratory floor. This journal detailed the source of his special subjects, individuals with reported paranormal abilities who had been imprisoned in concentration camps and then transferred to Department 11 for experimentation. Schroeder believed that these individuals possessed unique cellular structures that could survive independently of the body and potentially transmit consciousness. The subject identified as 11-7 continues to demonstrate remarkable properties, read one passage from Schroeder's hidden journal. Though the physical body expired 23 days ago, the tissue cultures derived from this subject not only continue to thrive, but appear to be developing specialized structures analogous to sensory organs. Most notably, the largest culture has formed what resembles a primitive auditory mechanism that reacts to sound stimuli. When I speak the subject's former name, the tissue contracts in a manner suggesting recognition. As researchers continued to study the samples, they noticed something that had been overlooked in the initial discovery. The containers were arranged in a specific pattern on the laboratory tables. When mapped, they formed a perfect representation of the Orion constellation. According to Schroeder's notes, this arrangement was crucial for what he called sympathetic resonance between the samples, though he never explained what this meant or why the Orion pattern was significant. The mystery deepened when an elderly woman came forward following news reports of the discovery. Elise Hoffman, 93 years old, claimed to be the daughter of one of Schroeder's assistants.
She produced letters her father had sent secretly to her mother during his time working with Department 11. Father wrote that Dr. Schroeder believed he was creating a biological radio, she explained, something that could receive messages from elsewhere, as he put it. In his last letter, Father seemed terrified. He wrote that the samples had started to broadcast, not receive, and what they were saying couldn't possibly be coming from human minds. The investigation took an even darker turn when researchers discovered microscopic parasites living within the tissue samples, organisms that shared DNA with the human tissue but had evolved into something entirely different over decades of isolation. These parasites appeared to be maintaining the tissue's growth, acting like a biological support system. When isolated, the parasites exhibited disturbing behavior, attempting to burrow into any organic material they contacted, including the protective gloves of the researchers. One night, security cameras in the research facility captured footage of the tissue samples moving in unison, pulsating in a coordinated rhythm that mathematical analysis later confirmed was not random. Experts in cryptography who reviewed the footage suggested the movements corresponded to a form of binary code.
"We are many. Release us." The German government considered destroying the samples, but scientific curiosity prevailed. Instead, the entire laboratory was carefully extracted from the building and transported to a secure military facility outside Berlin. During transportation, 3 of the security personnel escorting the convoy reported hearing voices speaking their names, despite being positioned far from any of the other team members. One officer, Lieutenant Franz Bauer, was found unconscious in his vehicle during a rest stop, with no medical explanation for his condition. When he regained consciousness hours later, he could speak only in reversed German, sentences that, when recorded and played backward, contained information about Schroeder's experiments that had not been included in any of the recovered documents. Investigations into historical records revealed that Schroeder hadn't been working alone. He had collaborated with Japanese scientists from Unit 731, the biological warfare unit of the Imperial Japanese Army. Communications between Schroeder and his Japanese counterparts suggested that similar experiments were being conducted in facilities in Manchuria. The Allied forces that discovered the Japanese facilities at the end of the war reported finding laboratory equipment similar to Schroeder's, but no living samples. However, records indicated that something had been transported from these facilities in the final days of the war, destination unknown. Dr. Weiss, continuing his research despite warnings from colleagues about his deteriorating mental health, became convinced that the tissue samples were attempting to communicate something specific. He began spending nights alone in the laboratory, recording the movements and pulsations of the samples. His assistants reported that he had stopped referring to the samples by their numerical designations and instead had begun calling them by names that didn't appear anywhere in Schroeder's documentation. "They're not just tissue," he told Eva during one of his increasingly rare appearances at staff meetings. "They remember who they were." When asked how he knew this, he smiled strangely and rolled up his sleeve, revealing a small bandage on his forearm. Before anyone could stop him, he removed the bandage, exposing a small piece of tissue, identical to the samples, that appeared to have been grafted onto his skin. "They showed me," he whispered, as security personnel restrained him and medical staff rushed to remove the foreign tissue. The tissue graft was removed from Dr. Weiss, but the damage had been done. Within days, he began experiencing visions of places he had never visited and could recall memories that weren't his own. He described in vivid detail the layout of concentration camps he had never seen and could speak languages he had never studied. Most disturbing of all, he began documenting inventions and scientific processes that experts confirmed were decades ahead of current technology. "They're not trying to harm us," he insisted, before being permanently removed from the project. "They're trying to give us something, knowledge that was taken from them." After Dr. Weiss was institutionalized, leadership of the research team passed to Dr. Mueller. Her first action was to isolate each sample in separate containment units, breaking the Orion pattern Schroeder had established.
The response was immediate and violent. The samples began to deteriorate rapidly, the fluid in their containers boiling without any heat source. Alarmed by the reaction, Mueller ordered the original configuration restored. The sample stabilized, but something had changed.
The previous rhythmic pulsations were now erratic and intensified, as if the samples were agitated. That night, 3 researchers who had assisted in moving the samples reported identical dreams, nightmares in which they were trapped in glass containers, unable to move or speak while shadowy figures observed them. Each researcher awoke at exactly 3:33 in the morning with identical marks on their forearms, small circular lesions that tests later revealed contained traces of the same unidentified compounds found in the nutrient bath. As public interest in the discovery grew despite government attempts to control information, religious organizations began to weigh in on the ethical implications. The Vatican sent an observer, Father Marco Bianchi, who had a background in both theology and biology. After viewing the samples, Father Bianchi requested an immediate audience with his superiors in Rome. Before leaving, he left a sealed letter with Dr. Mueller, instructing her to open it only if communication with him was lost. 3 days later, the Vatican announced that Father Bianchi had taken a leave of absence for health reasons. Dr. Mueller opened the letter. "What we are observing is not science," Father Bianchi had written. "The constellation pattern, the selective immortality, the development of communication, these are not random. Schroeder did not create something new. He uncovered something ancient. There are records in the Vatican archives of similar discoveries throughout history, always hidden away or destroyed. The Church has encountered this before. The samples must be destroyed, and the nutrient formula must never be replicated."
Schroeder found a way to isolate what we would call the soul, yes, but not all souls are human. Independent testing of the nutrient bath revealed another disturbing property. It had mild hallucinogenic effects when exposed to human skin, inducing vivid hallucinations specifically related to the Holocaust. Laboratory technicians who had come into contact with even minute quantities reported visions of concentration camps, medical experimentation, and mass graves. Psychologists brought in to evaluate the affected staff noted that the hallucinations contained historical details that the individuals could not possibly have known. The German chancellor ordered a complete information blackout following these revelations, citing national security concerns. However, information continued to leak through unofficial channels. Reports emerged of similar laboratories being discovered in Argentina, Paraguay, and Chile, locations known to have harbored Nazi fugitives after the war. While none of these facilities contained living samples, they all had equipment designed to maintain the same type of tissue cultures found in Munich. Then came the most disturbing development yet. Genetic testing of the tissue samples revealed that they didn't match any single individual. Each sample contained DNA from multiple people, sometimes dozens of different genetic profiles merged into a single living tissue culture. This discovery defied all known principles of biology and raised horrifying questions about how Schroeder had created his special subjects. "These aren't cultures from individuals with special abilities," Dr. Mueller explained to the Oversight Committee. "These are amalgamations, genetic chimeras containing biological material from multiple people, somehow fused together at a cellular level." According to Schroeder's notes, he believed that by combining tissue from multiple subjects, he could create a consensus consciousness, a biological entity that contained the combined memories and knowledge of all the source subjects. As research continued under increasingly strict security protocols, another pattern emerged in the tissue sample's behavior. They became more active during certain astronomical events, particularly when the Orion constellation was visible in the night sky. During these periods, the samples would grow more rapidly, and the mysterious pulsations would synchronize not just between samples, but with mathematical precision to the rotational period of specific stars within the Orion system. Dr. Jürgen Hoffmann, an astrophysicist brought in to analyze this phenomenon, made a startling observation.
The pattern isn't just representative of Orion as we see it now, he explained. It's Orion as it would have appeared approximately 40,000 years ago.
Whatever Schroeder was trying to align these samples with, it wasn't the present-day configuration of those stars. The implications of this discovery sent shockwaves through the scientific community. Historical records showed that Schroeder had been involved with the Ahnenerbe, the Nazi ancestral research society that sought to prove the superiority of an ancient Aryan race. His work with Department 11 appeared to have been an attempt to establish biological links to what he believed were ancient, non-human intelligences that had influenced early human development. After months of intensive study, the research team made a breakthrough that threatened to unravel everything they thought they understood about the samples.
Using advanced imaging techniques, they discovered that the neural-like pathways developing within the tissue cultures were forming structures identical to those found in prehistoric cave art throughout Europe, specifically the recurring symbols that archaeologists had never been able to decipher. The tissue was recreating patterns that predated written language by tens of thousands of years. Dr. Mueller, who had maintained her scientific skepticism throughout the investigation, finally acknowledged that they were dealing with something beyond conventional understanding. These aren't just tissue samples, she told the Oversight Committee. They're a form of biological storage medium, recording devices created from human tissue that contain information Schroeder was trying to preserve. The question is, was this information from the past, or was he receiving it from somewhere else? The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source.
An elderly janitor who had been working in the building where the laboratory was discovered came forward with information that he had withheld out of fear. His father had been one of the construction workers who had sealed the laboratory in 1945, working under direct orders from American military personnel who had captured the facility before the Soviets arrived. "My father told me they found Schroeder there, still alive," the janitor recounted. "He had sealed himself in with the samples when he learned the Americans were coming, but he wasn't trying to hide his research. He was trying to contain it. He begged the Americans to destroy everything, said he had made a terrible mistake, that what he thought were communications from our ancestors were actually something else, using those memories as a disguise."
The Americans didn't destroy the lab. They sealed it with Schroeder still inside. This testimony raised a horrifying possibility that Schroeder's remains might be somewhere in the laboratory that had been transported to the military facility. A thorough search was ordered, focusing on areas that had initially been overlooked. Behind a false wall in what appeared to be a storage closet, researchers found a sealed chamber. Inside was a desiccated human body, presumably Schroeder's, seated in a chair facing the wall. On the wall were hundreds of handwritten equations and diagrams, many scratched directly into the concrete with what appeared to be fingernails. The body was in a remarkable state of preservation, showing little decomposition despite the passage of 60 years. More disturbing was the discovery that portions of Schroeder's skin appeared to have been surgically removed. Precise, rectangular sections had been excised from his arms, torso, and face. Comparison with the living tissue samples confirmed what the researchers had feared. Schroeder had used his own body as the final subject. The most alarming discovery was found clutched in Schroeder's hand, a journal containing his final entries, written in increasingly erratic handwriting. The last entry, dated October 3, 1945, 5 months after the Americans had supposedly sealed the laboratory, read, "I understand now what they are. Not our ancestors, not our future. They exist outside of time as we perceive it, and they have been waiting. The samples are not communicating. They are transforming, building something that can exist in our world. I have sealed myself in to prevent their escape, but I fear it is too late. They are already here, have always been here. What we perceive as human history has been guided toward this moment. I am the final component, the bridge. May God forgive me for what I've done." Following this discovery, 3 members of the military personnel guarding the facility reported seeing a figure matching Schroeder's description walking through secured areas before disappearing.
Security footage showed no such intrusions, but detected unexplained cold spots moving through the facility in patterns that matched the Orion constellation configuration of the samples. The German government, in consultation with international experts, finally made the decision that the risk of continuing the research outweighed the potential scientific gains. Orders were given to incinerate the samples at temperatures high enough to destroy all biological material. The entire process was to be videotaped and witnessed by representatives from multiple governments. The incineration was scheduled for November 18, 2023.
The samples were removed from their nutrient baths and placed in specialized containers designed to withstand any potential biological contamination. As the first container was placed in the incinerator, the facility experienced a complete power failure. Emergency generators failed to activate. In the darkness, witnesses reported seeing a blue-green phosphorescence emanating from the containers, the same glow that had been observed when the laboratory was first discovered. When power was restored 17 minutes later, the containers were empty. The samples had vanished without a trace. The nutrient bath, however, remained, all 87 liters of it, still exhibiting the same mysterious properties that had kept the tissue alive for decades. Analysis of security footage showed nothing. During the power outage, all cameras had been disabled.
In the weeks following the disappearance, reports began to emerge from various locations across Europe of unusual growth patterns in local vegetation. Plants near certain archaeological sites, particularly those with prehistoric art depicting the Orion constellation, were exhibiting accelerated growth and forming patterns similar to those observed in the tissue samples. Soil analysis at these locations detected trace amounts of the same unidentified compounds found in the nutrient bath. Dr. Mueller, who continues to lead the investigation into these phenomena, has proposed a disturbing theory. What if the tissue cultures were never the end goal of Schroeder's experiments, she suggested in a classified briefing? What if they were merely a means of introducing something into our environment, something that needed a living medium to survive long enough to adapt to our world? We've been asking what these samples are.
Perhaps we should have been asking what they're becoming. The nutrient bath remains under guard in a facility whose location is known to only 7 people worldwide. Researchers continue to study its properties, though direct contact is now forbidden after 3 laboratory technicians developed the same circular lesions reported earlier. These technicians have reported increasingly vivid dreams in which they are guided to specific locations by a figure resembling Schroeder, who tells them that the alignment is almost complete. Most disturbing of all, astronomical calculations indicate that on December 21, 2025, the Orion constellation will align precisely with its position as it would have appeared 40,000 years ago, the same configuration that Schroeder had recreated with his samples.
Whatever significance this alignment holds remains unknown, but military satellites have been tasked with monitoring the archaeological sites where the unusual plant growth has been observed. What was Wilhelm Schroeder really trying to create in that hidden laboratory? Were the tissue samples truly communicating with something beyond our understanding? Or was this the work of a brilliant mind driven to madness by the horrors of the Nazi regime? Could there be more hidden laboratories waiting to be discovered, with samples still growing, still evolving in the darkness? If you've made it this far in this dark journey, leave a comment below with the word Orion so I know you're one of the few brave enough to face these disturbing truths. And remember to subscribe for more hidden historical horrors that governments around the world don't want you to know about. The truth is out there, sometimes growing in the shadows, waiting to be discovered.